It's a quiet Tuesday evening in a dimly lit bar somewhere in Manhattan, the kind of place where the amber glow of vintage lamps casts long shadows across worn leather booths and the scent of aged whiskey mingles with decades of stories soaked into the wooden walls. In the corner, barely noticed by the handful of patrons nursing their drinks, sits an elderly woman with silver hair pinned back in an elegant bun, her weathered fingers dancing across the keys of an old upright piano that has seen better days. She's playing My Way, that iconic anthem of defiance and self-determination, and while her hands shake slightly with age, every note carries the weight of 1,000 lived experiences. The bartender wipes down glasses with practiced indifference, a businessman in the corner booth scrolls through his phone, and a young couple whispers sweet nothings to each other, completely unaware that in the next few minutes, something extraordinary is about to unfold that will capture the hearts of millions around the world. Because as that elderly pianist reaches the bridge of the song, pouring her soul into every chord, the heavy oak door of the bar swings open, and a figure steps inside that will transform this ordinary evening into a moment of pure magic that nobody present will ever forget. The woman at the piano is Margaret Sullivan, though everyone who knows her calls her Maggie, and at 78 years old, she's been playing piano for nearly 7 decades. Her story isn't one of fame or fortune, but rather the quiet dedication of someone who fell in love with music as a little girl and never let that love fade, even when life threw every conceivable hardship her way. Maggie grew up in a small apartment in Brooklyn where her mother, a seamstress who worked 16-hour days to keep food on the table, somehow managed to scrape together enough money to buy a used piano from a neighbor who was moving away. That piano became Maggie's sanctuary, her escape from the cramped quarters and the constant worry about money that hung over their household like a persistent fog. She taught herself to play by ear initially, listening to records on an old gramophone and painstakingly figuring out the melodies until her fingers could reproduce them. When she was 12, a music teacher at her school noticed her gift and offered to give her lessons for free, recognizing a raw talent that deserved nurturing regardless of the family's financial circumstances. Maggie flourished under this guidance, spending every spare moment at the piano, her fingers growing stronger and more confident with each passing month. By the time she was 18, Maggie was good enough to play professionally, and she landed a job playing piano at a supper club in Manhattan, an elegant establishment where well-dressed couples came to dance and drink champagne while she provided the soundtrack to their evenings. It was 1965, and the world was changing rapidly, but in that club, time seemed to move more slowly, preserving a certain elegance and sophistication that was already beginning to feel like a relic of a bygone era. Maggie loved every minute of it. She loved the way the lights would dim and all eyes would turn to the small stage when she began to play, loved the feeling of her fingers flying across the keys as couples swayed on the dance floor, loved the generous tips that patrons would leave in the glass jar on top of her piano. It was during one of those magical evenings that she met Thomas, a junior architect with kind eyes and a gentle smile who came into the club with a group of colleagues but spent the entire evening watching her play. When she took her break, he approached her nervously, stumbling over his words as he complimented her playing, and she found his awkwardness endearing. They talked for the duration of her break, and when she returned to the piano, she played just for him, even though 100 other people filled the room. Thomas became a regular at the club, always sitting at the same table near the piano, always ordering the same drink, always waiting patiently for her breaks so they could talk. Within 6 months, they were married in a small ceremony attended by close family and a few friends, and Maggie moved into Thomas's apartment in Queens, a cozy space with large windows that let in streams of golden sunlight. She continued playing at the club, and Thomas's architecture career began to take off, and for a few blissful years, life felt like one of those perfect songs where every note falls exactly where it should. They talked about having children, about buying a house in the suburbs, about growing old together, and all the adventures they would have along the way. Maggie would play piano in their living room on Sunday mornings while Thomas made breakfast, the smell of coffee and bacon mixing with the sound of Chopin and Gershwin, and in those moments, she felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But life, as Maggie would learn, doesn't always follow the melody you expect. Thomas was diagnosed with leukemia when he was just 32 years old, and despite aggressive treatment and Maggie's unwavering devotion as she cared for him through the brutal rounds of chemotherapy, he passed away 18 months later, leaving her alone in that apartment that suddenly felt too large and too quiet. She was 29 years old and a widow, and for months after Thomas's death, she couldn't bring herself to touch the piano. The instrument that had once been her greatest joy now felt like a painful reminder of everything she had lost, and it sat in the corner of her living room gathering dust while Maggie went through the motions of living without really feeling alive. She took a job as a secretary at a law firm to pay the bills, work that required none of her passion or creativity, but provided a steady paycheck and health insurance, and she existed in a state of numb routine that stretched on for nearly a year. It was Thomas's mother, a fierce and loving woman who refused to let Maggie disappear into her grief, who finally snapped her out of it. She showed up at Maggie's apartment one Saturday morning with a thermos of strong coffee and a determination in her eyes that brooked no argument, and she sat Maggie down and told her in no uncertain terms that Thomas would be heartbroken to see her like this, that he had loved her music almost as much as he loved her, and that the greatest tribute she could pay to his memory would be to play again. The words cracked something open inside Maggie, and she wept harder than she had since the funeral, great heaving sobs that seemed to pour out all the pain she'd been holding inside. When the tears finally subsided, she walked over to the piano, lifted the cover from the keys, and began to play Clair de Lune, one of Thomas's favorites. Her fingers were rusty at first, stumbling over passages that had once been second nature, but gradually the music came back to her, flowing through her like water finding its natural course. From that day forward, Maggie played again, though not professionally at first. She played for herself, in her apartment, processing her grief through music in a way that words never could. She played angry, crashing chords when rage at the unfairness of it all consumed her, and soft, melancholy melodies when sadness wrapped around her like a heavy blanket, and gradually, imperceptibly, the playing helped her heal. Eventually, she began performing again, taking gigs at small venues around the city, piano bars and hotel lobbies, and the occasional private party. The work was inconsistent and the pay was modest, but it brought her back to life in a way that nothing else could. She never remarried, though she had opportunities over the years. Something in her remained forever loyal to Thomas, and besides, she told friends with a wry smile, she was already in a committed relationship with her piano. The decades passed, as they do, and Maggie kept playing. She played through the 70s with its disco and punk rock, maintaining her dedication to the jazz standards and classic ballads that were her specialty. She played through the 80s as the city around her transformed, watched from piano benches as neighborhoods gentrified and the character of New York shifted. She played through the 90s and into the new millennium, adapting to changing tastes while staying true to her own musical identity. Her hair turned from brown to gray to silver, her hands developed arthritis that made playing more difficult and sometimes painful, her eyesight weakened so that she needed stronger and stronger glasses to read sheet music, but still she played. Music was more than her livelihood. It was her identity, her purpose, her connection to both her past and the world around her. By the time she was in her mid-70s, Maggie had become something of a fixture in a particular piano bar in Manhattan, a place called the Velvet Note that catered to an older clientele who appreciated classic songs performed with skill and heart. The owner, a gruff but kind-hearted man named Danny, had known Maggie for years and gave her a regular gig playing 3 evenings a week, a schedule that provided her with enough money to cover her modest expenses while not being so demanding that it exhausted her. The regulars at the Velvet Note loved her, requesting their favorite songs and leaving generous tips that supplemented her small social security check. She had become part of the fabric of the place, as much a fixture as the vintage photographs on the walls or the antique mirror behind the bar. On this particular Tuesday evening, Maggie had arrived at the Velvet Note at her usual time, exchanged pleasantries with Danny, settled herself at the piano, and begun her first set with "The Way You Look Tonight," letting her fingers warm up with a song she could play in her sleep. The bar was quieter than usual, just a handful of customers, which suited Maggie fine. She sometimes preferred the quiet nights when she could play more for herself than for an audience, when she could lose herself completely in the music without worrying about taking requests or maintaining a certain energy level. After a few more standards, she transitioned into My Way, that towering anthem of self-determination that Frank Sinatra had made famous in 1969, though it had originally been a French song called Comme d'habitude before Paul Anka wrote English lyrics specifically for Sinatra. Maggie had always had a complicated relationship with My Way. On one hand, it was a beautiful song with a powerful message about living life on your own terms and facing the end with no regrets. On the other hand, it had been played at Thomas's funeral at his mother's request, and for years afterward, Maggie couldn't perform it without tears streaming down her face. But time has a way of transforming even the most painful associations, and eventually, My Way became less about loss and more about celebration, a reminder of the life she and Thomas had shared and the resilience she had shown in building a life for herself after he was gone. Now, when she played it, she thought about all the choices she had made, both good and bad, all the roads taken and not taken, and she felt at peace with how everything had unfolded. She had indeed done it her way, and while her life hadn't turned out the way she'd once imagined, it had been a good life, filled with music and connection and moments of profound beauty. She was midway through the second verse, her voice soft and slightly wavering as she sang along with her playing, when the door opened and a figure entered. Maggie didn't look up immediately, focused as she was on a particularly intricate run of notes, but she heard the bartender Danny gasp audibly, heard the sound of a glass being set down perhaps more forcefully than intended. Something in the quality of the silence that fell over the room made her glance up, her fingers continuing to move across the keys on autopilot, and what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Standing just inside the doorway, dressed in an elegant suit and fedora despite the casual nature of the establishment, was a face she recognized instantly, a face that millions around the world would recognize, a face that had graced album covers and movie screens and magazine spreads for decades. Frank Sinatra, the voice himself, the man who had made My Way into an anthem, was standing in the velvet note, and he was looking directly at her. For a moment, Maggie's fingers fumbled on the keys, producing a discordant note that made her wince, but she recovered quickly, her professionalism and decades of experience overriding her shock. She kept playing, kept singing, though her mind was racing with 1,000 questions. What was Frank Sinatra doing in this modest piano bar? Was it really him, or was her aging eyesight playing tricks on her? But no, even across the dimly lit room, she could see the unmistakable features, slightly older than in his prime but still commanding, still possessed of that indefinable charisma that had made him a legend. He removed his fedora as he moved further into the bar, revealing that famous hairline, and he took a seat at a small table near the piano, his eyes never leaving Maggie as she continued to play his signature song. The bar's handful of other patrons had now realized who had entered, and a ripple of excitement moved through the room, though everyone seemed instinctively to understand that this was a moment that required a certain reverence and restraint. Nobody rushed over for autographs or photos. They simply watched, transfixed, as this legendary performer sat in quiet attention while an elderly woman played his most famous song. Maggie could feel the weight of his gaze, and it made her simultaneously nervous and exhilarated. She poured everything she had into the performance, her arthritic fingers moving with a grace and precision that surprised even her voice gaining strength as she reached the song's powerful crescendo. "I did it my way," she sang, and the words seemed to carry a deeper meaning in that moment, a statement not just of fictional bravado but of actual lived truth. When the final notes faded into silence, there was a beat of absolute quiet, the kind of pregnant pause that occurs when something significant has just happened and everyone present knows it. Then Frank Sinatra began to clap, a slow, deliberate applause that was quickly joined by everyone else in the bar, and Maggie felt tears spring to her eyes. The chairman of the board himself was applauding her, and the surreal nature of the moment threatened to overwhelm her. Sinatra stood from his table and approached the piano, and Maggie's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Up close, she could see the lines that time had etched into his famous face, but his eyes were bright and alert, twinkling with warmth and something that looked like genuine admiration. "That was beautiful," Sinatra said, his voice that distinctive instrument that had crooned countless classics, though now it carried the slight rasp of age. "You really put your heart into it. I could feel every word." Maggie opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She felt like a starstruck teenager, not a woman who had been performing professionally for over 5 decades. She finally managed to stammer out a thank you, her voice barely above a whisper, and Sinatra smiled, a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "How long have you been playing?" he asked, and Maggie found her voice enough to tell him about her life in music, about learning on that used piano in Brooklyn, about the supper club where she met Thomas, about the decades of gigs in piano bars and hotel lobbies across Manhattan. Sinatra listened with genuine interest, asking questions and nodding appreciatively, and gradually Maggie relaxed into the conversation, speaking to him not as a legend but as a fellow musician, someone who understood the joys and challenges of a life dedicated to music. He told her that he had been walking through the neighborhood, drawn by nostalgia for the jazz clubs of his youth, and had heard piano music floating out of the Velvet Notes open window. Something about the quality of the playing had compelled him to come inside, and he had arrived just as she was beginning "My Way." "Fate," he said with a shrug and a smile, or maybe just a good sense of timing. He asked if she would play something else, anything she wanted, and Maggie, feeling emboldened by his encouragement and genuine interest, launched into "Fly Me to the Moon," another Sinatra classic, and as she played, something magical happened. Frank Sinatra began to sing. His voice, though aged, still carried that unmistakable quality that had made him one of the greatest vocalists of the 20th century, and as his voice blended with Maggie's piano playing, the entire bar seemed to hold its breath. This impromptu duet between a legend and an unknown piano player in a modest Manhattan bar was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years, the kind of story that would be told and retold, gaining mythical qualities with each retelling. The young couple who had been whispering to each other pulled out their phones and began recording, capturing shaky but unmistakable footage of Sinatra singing in a piano bar with an elderly woman accompanying him. The businessman in the corner booth abandoned all pretense of work and simply watched, tears streaming down his face. Danny, the bartender, stood frozen behind the bar, a bottle of whiskey clutched in one hand, completely forgetting what he had been about to pour. They played 3 songs together that night: "Fly Me to the Moon," "The Lady is a Tramp," and finally, at Maggie's request, "One for My Baby" and "One More for the Road," that melancholy meditation on loneliness and late-night confessions that seemed perfect for the intimate setting. With each song, Maggie grew more confident, her playing becoming more expressive and adventurous, responding to Sinatra's phrasing and adding her own flourishes. For his part, Sinatra seemed to be genuinely enjoying himself, smiling and occasionally nodding at Maggie when she did something particularly clever with the arrangement. This wasn't the polished, rehearsed performance of a concert hall. This was jazz in its purest form, 2 musicians connecting through their shared love of music, feeding off each other's energy, and creating something spontaneous and unrepeatable. When they finished "One for My Baby," Sinatra shook Maggie's hand warmly, then on impulse, leaned down and kissed her cheek. "You're a real talent," he told her. "Don't let anyone tell you different. Keep playing, keep putting that heart into it." He pulled out his wallet and placed several $100 bills in her tip jar, waving off her protestations. "From one musician to another," he said firmly. He chatted for a few more minutes with Danny and some of the patrons, signed a couple of napkins, and then, as suddenly as he had arrived, he was gone, disappearing into the Manhattan night and leaving behind a bar full of people who could hardly believe what they had just witnessed. In the immediate aftermath of Sinatra's departure, the bar erupted into excited chatter. Everyone wanted to talk about what had just happened, to confirm with each other that they had really seen what they thought they had seen, to share their own impressions of the incredible encounter. Maggie sat at the piano, still slightly dazed, running her fingers over the keys absently as if to reassure herself that they had really just created that music together. Danny brought her a glass of water and a whiskey, setting both on top of the piano with a shake of his head. "In all my years running this place," he said, "I've never seen anything like that. That was special, Maggie. Really special." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, afraid that if she tried to put words to what she was feeling, the emotion would overwhelm her. The young couple who had recorded the encounter approached Maggie shyly, asking if it would be okay if they posted the videos online. In her emotional state, Maggie didn't fully grasp what they were asking, and she agreed with a vague wave of her hand, not really thinking about the implications. She was still processing the fact that Frank Sinatra had walked into her workplace, listened to her play, sung with her, kissed her cheek, and told her she was talented. It felt like a dream, like one of those fantasies you indulge in but never expect to actually happen. The young couple, whose names were Jessica and Michael, thanked her profusely and immediately began uploading the videos to their social media accounts, writing captions about the incredible, serendipitous encounter they had just witnessed. Within an hour, the videos began to spread. What happened over the next few days was something that nobody could have predicted. The footage of Frank Sinatra singing in a small piano bar with an unknown elderly pianist struck a chord that resonated far beyond anyone's expectations. In an age of cynicism and manufactured celebrity moments, here was something authentic, something spontaneous and beautiful that couldn't be staged or replicated. The story had everything: nostalgia for a golden age of music, the legendary Sinatra in an intimate setting, the underdog narrative of an elderly woman who had dedicated her life to music without fame or fortune, and the pure joy of two musicians connecting through their shared passion. The videos went viral in the truest sense of the word, shared and reshared across every social media platform, written about in blogs and news sites, discussed on morning talk shows and evening news broadcasts. Within 48 hours, Maggie's life changed completely. Her phone, which usually rang only occasionally with calls from a few old friends and the occasional telemarketer, suddenly wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters wanted interviews, morning shows wanted her to appear as a guest, talent agents wanted to represent her, record companies wanted to discuss album deals. The Velvet Note became a destination, with people lining up outside hoping to see Maggie play, forcing Danny to implement a reservation system for the first time in the bar's 50-year history. Maggie's story resonated particularly with older people who saw in her a reflection of their own overlooked talents and unacknowledged dreams, but it also touched younger audiences who found her dedication and humility inspiring in an era of constant self-promotion and manufactured celebrity. The media coverage delved into Maggie's background, uncovering the story of her decades-long devotion to music, her tragic early widowhood, her quiet perseverance in the face of a life that hadn't turned out as planned. Journalists tracked down people who had known her over the years, former colleagues and friends who all spoke of her kindness, her talent, and her unwavering commitment to her craft. The story became bigger than just a cool celebrity encounter. It became a meditation on artistry, on the value of work done with love regardless of recognition, on the beauty that exists in corners of the world that rarely attract attention. Maggie became a symbol of something people yearned for but couldn't quite articulate, a reminder that real talent and genuine passion are worth celebrating regardless of whether they come packaged in youth and conventional success. Frank Sinatra, when reached for comment by entertainment journalists, confirmed the encounter and spoke warmly of Maggie's talent. "She's the real deal," he said. "Too many musicians today are all flash and no substance. Maggie plays from the heart, and that's what makes it timeless. I was honored to sing with her." His endorsement, coming from one of the most respected figures in music history, added weight to the narrative and helped ensure that Maggie wasn't dismissed as just a viral curiosity. She was a serious musician receiving recognition from one of the greats, and that mattered. Of course, with sudden fame came challenges and complications that Maggie wasn't prepared for. She found the constant attention exhausting and intrusive, unaccustomed as she was to living in any kind of spotlight. Photographers camped outside her modest apartment building, which annoyed her neighbors and made her feel guilty. She received thousands of messages on social media platforms she hadn't even known she had accounts on until a well-meaning nephew set them up for her, and while many were supportive and kind, some were cruel or creepy in ways that disturb her. Scammers try to take advantage of her sudden notoriety, reaching out with fake business opportunities or impersonating record executives. It was overwhelming and disorienting, this sudden transformation from anonymous piano player to viral sensation, and there were days when Maggie wished fervently that none of it had ever happened, that she could return to her quiet life of playing for a handful of people in a small bar. But there were positives too, undeniable silver linings that emerged from the chaos. A prestigious jazz label offered her a recording contract, and she found herself, at 78 years old, recording her first album in a professional studio. The experience was both thrilling and intimidating, working with young producers and engineers who treated her with deference and respect, carefully capturing her playing in ways that honored both the music and her decades of experience. The album, when it was released 6 months after the viral encounter, was titled simply My Way and featured Maggie performing jazz standards and classic ballads with the same heart and soul that had caught Sinatra's attention. It received strong reviews from critics who praised her technique and emotional depth, and while it didn't top the charts, it sold respectably and introduced her music to audiences who would never have discovered her otherwise. More importantly, perhaps, the sudden attention brought opportunities for Maggie to mentor young musicians, something she discovered she had a real passion for. A music school in Queens invited her to teach a masterclass, and she found immense satisfaction in working with talented young pianists, sharing not just technical knowledge, but the wisdom accumulated over decades of devotion to the craft. She emphasized to her students the importance of playing with feeling, of connecting with the emotional core of a song rather than just hitting the right notes, of perseverance and dedication even when success seems elusive. Many of her students told her that her story had inspired them to take their music more seriously, to view it not just as a hobby or a means to fame, but as a worthy pursuit in itself, and those conversations filled Maggie with a sense of purpose and fulfillment that fame never could. The encounter with Sinatra also reconnected Maggie with parts of her past she had lost touch with over the years. Old friends and colleagues who had drifted out of her life reached out after seeing the viral videos, leading to tearful phone calls and reunions. Thomas's relatives, whom she hadn't spoken to in years, contacted her to tell her how moved they were by her story and how proud Thomas would have been. A childhood friend from Brooklyn sent a letter reminding Maggie of the little girl who used to play piano at school assemblies, marveling at how that girl had grown into this remarkable woman whose talent had finally received the recognition it deserved. These connections to her past, these reminders of the journey she had traveled, proved more valuable than any of the material benefits that came with viral fame. As the initial frenzy began to die down and the news cycle moved on to other stories, Maggie gradually settled into a new normal that balanced aspects of her old life with the opportunities her newfound recognition had created. She continued playing at the Velvet Note, though now only one night a week due to other commitments, and Danny had to limit attendance to preserve the intimate atmosphere that had made the venue special in the first place. She took select performance opportunities at more prestigious venues, enjoying the chance to play for larger audiences, but always ensuring that the music remained her primary focus rather than the celebrity. She recorded a second album, then a third, each one showcasing different aspects of her artistry and earning critical respect, if not massive commercial success. Now, several years after that fateful Tuesday evening, Maggie reflects on everything that has happened with a mixture of gratitude and bemusement. She still can't quite believe that a chance encounter transformed her life so dramatically in her late 70s, an age when most people have settled into fixed patterns and routines. She thinks often about the role of luck and timing, about how many talented people labor in obscurity not because they lack ability, but simply because they never get that one break, that one moment of perfect serendipity that brings their work to wider attention. She feels fortunate, certainly, but also somewhat guilty, aware that her talent isn't necessarily greater than countless other musicians who continue to play in small venues for modest pay without ever achieving recognition. But what Maggie has come to understand, what the whole experience has taught her, is that the recognition was never really the point. Yes, it's nice to be acknowledged, to know that people appreciate what you do, to have opportunities that weren't available before. But the real reward, the thing that has sustained her through decades of anonymous performance and continues to sustain her now, is the music itself. The feeling of her fingers moving across the keys, finding the heart of a melody and expressing it with every ounce of skill and emotion she possesses. The connection that happens when a song resonates with a listener, creating a moment of shared humanity and understanding. The simple, profound satisfaction of doing something you love with dedication and integrity, regardless of who's watching or what you get in return. In interviews, Maggie is often asked about that evening with Sinatra, about what it felt like to perform with a legend, and she always answers honestly. It was thrilling, yes, and surreal, and wonderful in ways she can barely articulate. But what she remembers most clearly isn't Sinatra's celebrity or the way the videos went viral afterward. What she remembers is the pure musical connection, the way they listened to each other and responded, the way decades of experience allowed them to communicate through the music in ways that transcended words. She remembers that he treated her as a fellow musician, with respect and genuine interest, and that meant more than any amount of fame or recognition. The viral videos have now been viewed millions of times, becoming part of internet lore, one of those heartwarming stories that people share when they need a reminder that beautiful things still happen in the world. People from around the globe have reached out to Maggie, telling her that her story inspired them to pursue their own passions, to pick up instruments they had abandoned, to recognize that it's never too late for unexpected joy and recognition. She hears from other elderly people who feel invisible in a culture that worships youth, and they tell her that seeing her story made them feel seen and valued. She hears from young musicians struggling with whether to continue pursuing their art, and they tell her that her decades of dedication, her refusal to give up even when success seemed impossible, gave them the courage to persevere. These messages, more than the album releases or the performance opportunities or the features in prestigious publications, have shown Maggie that her story matters not because it's extraordinary, but because it's fundamentally ordinary in the best possible way. She's someone who loved something enough to keep doing it through grief and disappointment, through decades of little recognition, through the physical challenges of aging, and that dedication is something anyone can relate to and aspire to. The encounter with Sinatra was magical, certainly, but the real magic is in the lifetime of devotion that preceded it, in the choice to keep playing even when no one famous was watching, to keep pouring heart into her music even when the audience was just a handful of people in a small bar. Maggie still lives in Queens, in a slightly nicer apartment than before, but nothing ostentatious. She still plays piano every day, not because she has to, but because she can't imagine a day without music. She still thinks about Thomas, especially when she plays My Way, and she likes to imagine that somehow he knows about everything that's happened, that he's proud of her, that in some cosmic way the universe finally decided to reward her for her perseverance and dedication. On quiet mornings when she sits at her piano with sunlight streaming through the windows, playing just for herself with no audience and no pressure, she feels the same contentment she felt as a young woman when music was new and full of infinite possibility. The story of the elderly pianist and Frank Sinatra has taken on a life of its own, told and retold in various forms, sometimes embellished, sometimes simplified, but always retaining its essential magic. It's been featured in documentaries about viral moments that changed lives, in articles about the power of perseverance, in motivational speeches about finding success at any age. For some people, it's a feel-good story about celebrity kindness. For others, it's a reminder to notice and appreciate the talent that exists all around us, often in places we overlook. For Maggie herself, it's both a blessing and a responsibility, a gift that came when she least expected it and that she's determined to honor by staying true to the principles that guided her life before that Tuesday evening. She continues to mentor young musicians, finding this the most rewarding aspect of her late career recognition. She tells them about the importance of authenticity, of developing your own voice rather than trying to imitate others, of understanding that success in art isn't always about fame or fortune but about the fulfillment that comes from creating something meaningful. She shares stories from her decades of experience, both the highs and the devastating lows, painting an honest picture of what a life in music really looks like. Some of her students go on to successful careers. Others decide to pursue music as a serious hobby while building careers elsewhere, and she respects both paths, understanding that dedication to art can take many forms. Now in her early 80s, Maggie has begun to think about her legacy, about what she'll leave behind when she finally takes her leave of this world that has been both cruel and kind to her. She knows she won't be remembered like Sinatra, whose name will echo through history as long as people listen to music. But she's made peace with that, understanding that different people are meant for different kinds of impact. Her legacy will be the students she's taught, the people she's inspired through her story, the music she's created and shared with whoever would listen. It will be in the way she demonstrated that a life dedicated to art has inherent value regardless of recognition, that perseverance and integrity matter more than fame, that it's possible to find joy and meaning even when life doesn't unfold according to your plans. The elderly woman who sat at that piano on a quiet Tuesday evening, playing My Way for a handful of inattentive customers, couldn't have imagined that within minutes her life would change forever. But perhaps that's the point of her story, the reason it resonates so deeply with so many people. We never know when our moment might come, when the dedication and passion we've poured into our pursuits might suddenly be recognized and celebrated. And more importantly, we can't let the uncertainty of that recognition stop us from doing the work we love, from creating and contributing and connecting in whatever ways we can. Maggie played piano with heart and soul for decades when nobody famous was listening, and that dedication is what made her ready for that magical encounter when it finally arrived. The videos of that evening, grainy and shaky but unmistakably capturing something special, continue to circulate online, periodically resurfacing when someone discovers them anew and shares them with their network. Each time they make the rounds again, Maggie receives a fresh wave of messages from people touched by the story, and she tries to respond to as many as she can, understanding that her experience has meaning beyond her own life. She sees the videos sometimes herself, watching with a mixture of disbelief and nostalgia as her younger self by a few years plays while the legendary Sinatra sings, and she marvels at the strangeness of being able to witness one of the most important moments of your own life as if you're watching someone else. Frank Sinatra passed away a few years after that encounter, and Maggie mourned him with a depth of feeling that surprised her. She had known him only briefly, had spent perhaps an hour in his actual presence, but his kindness and encouragement had meant the world to her, and his passing felt like the loss of a friend rather than just a famous person she'd once met. She played at several tribute concerts in his honor, performing My Way and other Sinatra classics, and each time she played, she felt his presence, felt connected to that magical evening when two musicians from such different worlds had found common ground in their shared love of music. She likes to think that she gave him something valuable too, a reminder of why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place, a glimpse of the pure, uncommercial dedication that drives real artists. The Velvet Note still stands in Manhattan, and Maggie still plays there on occasional Tuesday evenings, maintaining that connection to her roots even as other opportunities have come her way. Danny eventually retired and his daughter took over the bar, but she's maintained the intimate, music-focused atmosphere that her father created, and she treats Maggie with a familial affection that touches the elderly pianist deeply. The crowd on Tuesday evenings now includes people who've traveled from other cities or even other countries specifically to see Maggie play, to be present in the place where that famous encounter happened. And while Maggie sometimes finds this attention bemusing, she's also grateful for the dedication. She makes a point of talking to audience members during her breaks, asking about their lives and their own relationships with music, treating them as individuals rather than anonymous fans. What strikes Maggie most about the whole experience is how it's connected her to people from all walks of life, all around the world, creating a web of human connection that extends far beyond her wildest dreams. She hears from nurses and teachers and construction workers and lawyers and students and retirees, all of them finding something in her story that speaks to their own experiences and aspirations. A woman in Japan writes to tell her that watching the viral video inspired her to start taking piano lessons at age 65, something she'd always wanted to do, but thought she was too old to begin. A man in Brazil tells her that her story motivated him to quit a soul-destroying corporate job and pursue his passion for painting, leading to the happiest period of his life. A teenager in Australia, struggling with depression, credits Maggie's demonstration of perseverance and dedication with helping her find hope and purpose. These connections, these countless small ways that her story has rippled out to touch other lives, have given Maggie a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. She understands now that her life, which seemed for so long to be small and inconsequential, playing in the background of other people's stories, has actually created something meaningful and lasting. Not through any grand plan or ambitious design, but simply through the accumulation of decades of dedication, of showing up and playing with integrity and heart regardless of the audience size or the amount of recognition. Her story demonstrates that you don't need to be extraordinary to have an extraordinary impact. You just need to be faithful to what you love and give it everything you have. As the sun sets on this remarkable chapter of her life, Maggie finds herself reflecting on the mysterious interplay of choice and chance, of preparation and opportunity that shapes every life. She chose to learn piano, chose to persevere through grief and disappointment, chose to keep playing even when success seemed impossible. But it was pure chance that brought Frank Sinatra to the Velvet Note that particular evening, pure chance that Jessica and Michael were there with their phones ready to record, pure chance that the video caught the attention of the right people and went viral in the way it did. You can't plan for that kind of serendipity, can't make it happen through willpower alone. All you can do is be ready when the moment comes, and readiness is built through years of dedication and practice and refusing to give up. The story that began with an elderly woman playing piano in an empty bar and ended with millions of people around the world knowing her name is, at its heart, a story about the value of dedication to craft, the importance of finding joy in the work itself rather than the recognition it might bring, and the beautiful unpredictability of life. It's a reminder that our moments of greatest visibility and success are built on foundations of faithful, often unrecognized labor, and that both the visible triumphs and the invisible preparation have value and meaning. It's a celebration of artistry in all its forms, of the countless talented people who create beauty in corners of the world that rarely attract attention, and of the occasional magical moments when that talent receives the recognition it deserves. Maggie knows that when her time comes, when she plays her final notes and takes her final bow, she'll be able to look back on her life with satisfaction and peace. She did it her way, pursuing what she loved with integrity and dedication, staying true to herself and her art even when the path was difficult and the destination uncertain. The viral fame, the albums, the prestigious performances, these are wonderful additions to her story, but they're not what defines it. What defines it is the 70 years of music, the countless hours at countless pianos, the joy and solace and connection that music has brought both to her and to everyone who's heard her play. That's the real legacy, the one that matters most, and it's something she built note by note, day by day, through a lifetime of dedication to something larger than herself. And sometimes, on quiet Tuesday evenings at the Velvet Note, when she's playing My Way for an intimate crowd that hangs on every note, she'll glance at the empty table where Frank Sinatra sat that magical evening, and she'll smile, remembering how a moment of serendipity transformed everything while also reinforcing what she'd always believed, that the music itself is the reward, that connection through art is its own kind of success, and that a life lived in service of something you love is a life well lived regardless of recognition. She'll pour all of those years, all of that feeling, into her playing, and for a few precious minutes, everyone in that bar will be transported to a place where dedication and talent and perseverance are celebrated, where age is no barrier to beauty, and where magic can happen when we least expect it but most need it.